The wind carried a bite that morning, dry and sharp as broken glass. It came off the hills in gusts that stripped the branches bare and sent tumbleweeds scratching across the hard-packed earth like they were trying to get away from something. Frost clung to the split-rail fence in a thin white sheen, and the sky a heavy gray without edges pressed low over the land as if the weight of winter had settled early. Jonah Macready stood in the yard with his collar turned up, one gloved hand wrapped tight around a mug gone cold. The steam had long since fled. So had the color in his knuckles. He hadn't slept. Not much use trying. The cows had bawled half the night, restless from the wind and something else, some low and steady dread he couldn't quite place. The barn door was ajar, just by an inch, enough to stir a sliver of unease. He hadn't left it like that. He crossed the yard slow, his boots crunching frostbitten grass, and pushed the door wide with a shoulder. The scent hit him first, old straw, damp wool, and something sharper beneath it, something human. Not the kind he expected. Not one of his ranch hands come back early or some drifter looking for warmth. It was too still inside for that. He didn't speak, just stepped inside, eyes adjusting to the murk. The horses stood quiet in their stalls, heads, low breath, clouding the air. No sign of panic. No sound but the creak of wood and the wind outside. Then came a cough. Weak. Wet. From behind the hay bales stacked in the corner. He drew his sidearm from his coat, not out of malice, just habit. Too many years taught him not to go barehanded into the unknown. He stepped carefully, crunching straw one boot after the other, until he saw her. A woman slumped half upright against the wall, knees pulled to her chest like a child hiding from the dark. Her face was dirty, hair tangled, clothes near threadbare. She clutched something tight to her chest, three little bundles huddled close, all bone and silence, wrapped in burlap and the rags of a blanket. He lowered the gun, not because the danger passed, but because he saw what the danger had already done. The woman looked up, eyes hollow with fever, mouth cracked from cold. "Don't," she rasped, barely audible. "Please. They ain't done nothing." Jonah knelt slowly, boots creaking as he eased down. "You're on my land," he said, flat voice, low but not unkind. "You're freezing. That one's not breathing right." She flinched when he reached toward the smallest child, but her strength gave out before her protest could rise. The little one was burning up, tiny chest rattling with every breath like wind through dry leaves. "Jesus," Jonah muttered. He didn't ask questions. Not then. Just shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around the boy, scooping him up as the mother watched through cracked eyes. She slumped forward as if the weight of release undid her. Jonah looked around the barn. It was no place for the half-dead. Not in this cold. Not with a storm coming. He whistled low to his dog, then turned back to the woman. "You'll freeze if you stay. All of you." The mother tried to speak, but her voice failed her. Instead, she gave the faintest nod, a gesture born more of surrender than trust. Jonah moved fast after that. Hauled the other two into his arms, got them to the house, laid them by the stove. He wrapped them in old quilts, boiled water, mixed powdered milk, and waited while the heat did its slow work. He didn't recognize himself in the flurry of motion, in the way his hands worked without instruction. He hadn't held a child since his own slipped away in a cradle one bitter February and his wife left not long after. Grief had taken the form of silence, and silence had become the shape of his life. Until this morning. She stirred sometime near noon, sat up stiffly on the settee, a quilt around her shoulders, lips pale. Her eyes scanned the room, then fell on her children still wrapped up by the stove. One was sucking weakly on a spoon. Another stirred in sleep. The smallest still lay quiet but breathing easier now. She looked at Jonah. Not grateful. Not afraid. Just hollow. "You got a name?" he asked, standing with his hands in his pockets. "Ruth," she said. Ruth Camden. He nodded once. I'm Jonah. She nodded back, then looked away. Outside the wind kept blowing. The fence line wavered in the white light. Nothing had changed and everything had. That night the wind died. It left behind a silence thick as wool, the kind that settles deep in a man's chest and stays there. Snow had begun to fall, a light dusting that clung to the porch rail and muffled the land in white. Inside the house the stove crackled and spit the heat, holding off the cold that pressed at the windows like an unwanted guest. Jonah sat at the table, a cup of coffee cooling untouched beside him. Across the room Ruth dozed in the rocker, her head tilted back, mouth slightly open. Her hair was clean now, pulled away from her face. The sharp angles of her jaw had softened just slightly with food and sleep, but she still looked too light, like a gust could blow her out the door. The children slept on pallets near the fire. The youngest, the one with the fever, stirred now and then, but no longer whimpered. Jonah had sat up most of the night before, just listening to that boy breathe, waiting for the silence he feared might come. It hadn't. He let out a breath, slow and careful, like something might break if he did it too fast. When Ruth woke, she didn't speak right away. Just shifted forward, eyes on the glowing stove, her hands curled tight in the folds of the quilt. How long? She asked finally. Jonah glanced over. Couple hours. Since you drifted off. No, she said. How long have we been here? He looked at the clock. Little more than a day. She nodded. A pause. Then quieter, feels longer. Jonah didn't answer that. Time had a strange way about it when suffering was involved. Some days stretched into years. Some years vanished between blinks. You got folks nearby? He asked. No. Anywhere. She shook her head. We was going west. Missouri first, then farther. Didn't make it past Rollins. My husband, her voice caught, and she swallowed it. He left. Took the mule and the last of the money. Said he'd find work. Didn't come back. Jonah didn't move. Didn't ask more. He knew the shape of abandonment too well to need details. The way it hollowed a person out. The way shame wrapped around it like barbed wire. They didn't eat for 2 days, she said after a while. I stretched what I could, but they kept crying. I couldn't stand it. I thought maybe I'd find something here. A potato. A chicken. Something. Her fingers gripped the quilt tighter. I didn't mean to steal. Jonah looked at the children. One of them stirred, whimpered softly, then rolled over. You didn't steal, he said. You came to survive. She blinked at that. Said nothing, but her mouth trembled slightly at the corners. He stood and crossed to the cupboard, pulled down 2 chipped plates. You hungry? She hesitated, as if weighing whether she deserved the offer. Then she nodded. Just once. He fried up eggs and cornbread, set her plate down without ceremony. She ate in silence, slowly, her back straight, her eyes steady. Not like a guest. More like someone waiting to be told to leave. I got work here, Jonah said, not looking at her. Chores that pile up fast this time of year. Could use a hand if you're able. Her fork paused. You'd let us stay. For now, he said. Winter's coming. I ain't the kind to throw a mother and 3 young children out into snow. Her throat worked, but she kept her head down. I can work. I can do laundrymen things. I've worked stock too. You'll earn your keep, he said. No charity. I wouldn't want it, she answered quick. They didn't say more. Just let the stove crackle between them like a fire between 2 cold strangers, warming both but untrusted still. Over the next few days Ruth kept to her word. She rose early, tied her hair back, and went to work without waiting to be asked. She scrubbed floors, mended torn sleeves, and cleaned the mud from boots with a focus that bordered on penance. She never asked for more food than needed, and she checked the children's fingers and toes each morning like a woman afraid of what cold could steal. Jonah watched her without speaking much. He wasn't used to people anymore. The house had long since settled into a rhythm of silence, and her presence disrupted it, like a creek cutting a new path through frozen ground. But he didn't mind. One morning he came in from the barn to find her standing at the stove, sleeves rolled up, flour dusting her knuckles. The smell of biscuits filled the kitchen. The children were still asleep, their cheeks pink from warmth and health. "You cook?" he asked, surprised. Ruth glanced over. "Not well," she said, "but better than starving." He gave a small grunt, sat down, and watched her move. There was something careful in the way she handled things, like she expected them to break if she wasn't gentle enough. She stirred with slow, steady motions, like she was trying not to remember the last time she made breakfast for more than herself. Something in Jonah's chest shifted. Just a little. Not pity. Recognition. The thaw came late that year. Even by Wyoming standards, the cold held its grip longer than it should. Snow drifted high along the north fence line, and the wind snapped down from the Buddhas like it had business to finish. But inside the McCready place, the days had started to stretch. By mid-February, light poured in through the south windows long enough to warm the floorboards and soften the air. Jonah noticed it first in the children. The way they stopped flinching every time a door slammed. The way their laughter started to stick, even if it came quiet and unsure at first. They made little games for themselves, stacking firewood, helping with eggs from the hen house, brushing down the old mule. The youngest, whom Ruth called Josiah, still wheezed on cold mornings, but he'd started to hum when he thought no one was listening. That did something to a man. Turned the silence in the house into something almost like music. Ruth worked like she owed the world something. She split kindling with practiced swings, mended the long abandoned clothesline, and cleaned the tack room until the scent of mildew gave way to oil and leather. She said little, but Jonah learned to read the set of her shoulders, the pause in her hands when a memory struck. She didn't cry, not where anyone could see, but some nights she stood too long at the sink after the dishes were done, just staring out at the field where the snow melted in patches. She was strong but not untouched, and he respected that. He never asked about her husband again, and she never spoke of him. There was no ring on her finger and no trace of one. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was a kind of boundary. But that boundary softened with time. One morning in March, Ruth followed Jonah out to the barn without being asked. He glanced back at her, a brow raised. "You don't need to be out here," he said. She shrugged, tugging on a pair of gloves. "Don't see why not." He let her help with the calving. Let her hold the lantern while he worked the slick, trembling body of a new calf from its mother. She didn't flinch, didn't look away when blood hit her boots. Just held the light, steady hands firm. Afterward they stood side by side, steam rising from the calf as it blinked into its new world. "You done that before?" he asked. "Once," she said. "A long time ago." "She'll take to it," he said, nodding toward the cow. "That one's a good mother." Ruth didn't answer right away. Then, almost too soft to hear, "It's not always enough." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't try. They worked side by side more after that, fixing fence posts, hauling water, brushing down the horses in the last gray light of day. She had questions sometimes about the land, about the animals, about the names etched in old wooden boards nailed to the barn wall. "Your family?" she asked one evening, touching a name carved into the stall door, Elias McCready, 1879. "My father," Jonah said. "He built this place with his brothers. Most of 'em gone now. You alone. Been that way a while." She looked at him a moment. "Does it get easier?" He met her gaze. "No," he said. "But it gets quieter." She nodded, said nothing else. Spring came in halting steps. Patches of green began to show where the snow had receded, and the air carried the scent of thawing earth. Jonah found himself looking for her more often at mealtime, out in the field, anywhere her hands were busy and her mind far away. He'd catch himself staring, not at her beauty, though there was that, but at the way she carried sorrow without letting it win. One evening after supper, she brought out a small bundle of cloth and set it gently on the table. Inside were the pieces of a broken pocket watch, brass gears, the face cracked clean through. "It was my father's," she said. "Used to let me hold it when I was small. Said it didn't work, but it kept time better than most folks." Jonah picked up the pieces, careful with the tiny gears. "It can be fixed," he said. "Not by me. I could try." She smiled then. A small, tired thing, but it stayed a while. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch, watching stars blink to life. She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, and Jonah handed her his coat without a word. She took it. This time she didn't hand it back. The quiet between them had changed. It wasn't made of absence anymore. It was full of possibility. The first storm of spring came without warning. A wall of cloud rolled in from the west, black-bellied and fast-dragging rain that struck the roof like fists. The wind howled hard enough to rattle the glass, and lightning forked across the sky like it meant to split the earth. Jonah got the animals in just ahead of it, soaked through and muddy, his hat lost to the wind somewhere between the paddock and the gate. Ruth was already at the door with a towel and a bucket of hot water, her hair pinned back, jaw set. She didn't ask what he needed, just started wringing out his coat and checking the latch on the shutters. The children huddled near the hearth, wide-eyed but calm. The house had become familiar to them. Safe. After the worst of it passed, Jonah stood at the window watching the downpour turn the yard into a slick mess of water and old straw. His shoulder ached. It always did when the weather turned. Behind him, Ruth poured 2 mugs of coffee and came to stand beside him. "A storm like that back in Missouri meant we'd lose a roof shingle, maybe a chicken," she said. "Out here it feels like something might disappear." He gave a short laugh. "Out here it might." She sipped her coffee, watching the rain streak down the glass. "What's it like?" she asked after a long pause. "When it's just you. No one else to answer to. No one waiting on you to come home." He didn't answer right away. "It's quiet. Some days that's good. Other days it's like being buried alive with your own thoughts." She nodded as if she understood exactly. After that storm, the ground turned soft and the work changed. Fence lines had to be walked again, hoofprints checked for rot. Ruth went with him most days. Her clothes were still patched and plain, but she moved more sure-footed now, eyes alert. She didn't ask to rest. She didn't complain. They fell into a rhythm, not just in chores, but in talk. Little things. She started asking about which horses he'd bred and which ones came from his father's stock. He asked if she missed the town where she grew up. She told him yes, but not the people in it. Too many eyes. Too many mouths, she said. None of them kind. Some afternoons they sat on the porch in the sun while the children played in the dirt yard with sticks and stones, inventing kingdoms. Jonah would sharpen his tools while Ruth mended shirts, the two of them working in a silence that didn't feel like work at all. But nothing stays easy. One morning, just as the first wildflowers started poking through near the creek, a wagon rolled up the drive. Jonah heard the wheels before he saw the man, tall, lean, with a cocked hat and a silver chain that caught the sun. He didn't knock. Just stood at the fence watching the house, like he already knew what he'd find. Ruth stepped outside just as Jonah did. The man smiled. "Well, ain't this something?" Her face went still pale. The blood drained right out of it. "Ruthie," the man said, tipping his hat. "Didn't think you'd end up in a place like this. Thought you might have gone and drowned somewhere." Jonah stepped forward slow. "You know this man." She didn't answer. Her hands were shaking. The man chuckled. "Name's Vance Camden. I believe this here's my wife." Jonah's eyes didn't move. "She said you left her." "Just temporary," Vance said, spreading his hands. "A man's gotta look for work, don't he? You wouldn't believe the trouble I ran into. I was headed back when the wagon wheel busted outside Rollins. Lost all I had. Took months to scrape back." Ruth still hadn't spoken. Her mouth was a flat line, her arms crossed tight over her chest like she could hold something inside that wanted to spill out. "I ain't here for a fight," Vance said. "Just want what's mine. My wife, my kids." Jonah's hand clenched around the fence rail. "You left them to starve." "I left them to survive," Vance snapped. "Which they did thanks to your generosity. And now I'm here to take 'em home." Ruth finally spoke. "There is no home." Vance looked at her, eyes narrowed. "What'd he fill your head with?" "Nothing," she said. Her voice was steady now. "You filled it for years. With fear. With fists." His jaw tightened. "You think you're better than me now?" "I don't think," she said. "I know." Jonah stepped between them. "You should leave." Vance glanced between them, something sharp rising in his face, but then he caught sight of the children watching from the window. He spat in the dirt and turned back toward the wagon. "You'll regret this," he said over his shoulder. "Maybe," Ruth answered. "But it'll be my regret. Not yours." The wagon rolled away, wheels sinking deep in the soft earth. Jonah watched until it disappeared over the rise. Inside, Ruth leaned against the doorframe. She looked like she'd just walked through a fire. He didn't say anything, just stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, both of them breathing in the quiet after the storm. That night the house held a strange stillness, not the peace they'd come to know, but a quiet that braced for something yet to come. The children were tucked in early. Jonah heard their breathing, slow, steady through the thin walls, but he knew they hadn't fallen into real sleep. Fear, once learned, doesn't vanish easily. Ruth stayed in the kitchen long after the dishes were dry, running a cloth over the table, again and again, not to clean but to steady herself. Her hands wouldn't stop moving. Jonah sat nearby, elbows resting on his knees, watching the wood burn low in the stove. "I thought I'd be free when he left," she said finally, her voice low and flat. But even gone, he filled every corner. His silence was louder than his shouting. Jonah didn't speak. He knew the sound she meant. "I used to count every breath, every step, every second between when the door opened and when the blow landed. After he left, I kept counting. Only this time it was hours. Days. Prayers." She turned to face him then. "He didn't come back for love. He came because someone else wouldn't have him. That's the only reason." Jonah nodded once. "He won't come back here again." "You don't know that." "I don't need to," he said. "But I'll be ready if he does." Her mouth opened then closed. She looked away and her hand gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. "I hate that part of me still wanted him to change. That when I saw that wagon I didn't run." "You didn't run," he said. "But you didn't stay either. You stood up." Something broke in her face then, not a collapse, not tears, but a soft unraveling. Like a thread pulled free after years knotted tight. She sat down across from him, eyes shining but dry. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "Neither do I," he answered. "But the land needs tending. Fences to mend, seed to plant." She gave a small smile at that. "So you're saying I've still got chores?" He smiled back, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Always?" The next morning they worked in the north field. The snowmelt had left the ground soft but stubborn, and the fence posts needed resetting where the frost had heaved them loose. Ruth swung the post maul with steady rhythm, sweat streaking her brow. Jonah tamped the earth around each post, their hands moving in silent understanding. They didn't talk much that day, but the quiet wasn't heavy. It held room for thought, for healing, for hope. In the evenings, Ruth sat at the table repairing her father's watch. Jonah had laid out the tools for her: tiny screwdrivers, tweezers, a magnifier. She'd never fixed anything so small before, but she had the patience now. The steadiness. She said little while she worked, but the concentration on her face reminded Jonah of his mother, quilting through the winter months, deliberate, calm, sacred. One night, weeks later, she clicked the back of the watch shut and held it to her ear. Tick. It was faint, but it was there. She looked at Jonah and didn't smile at first, just let the sound settle inside her like music. Then, without a word, she crossed the room and pressed the watch into his hand. "You fixed it," he said. "No," she replied. "You did." He started to hand it back, but she shook her head. "I've carried it long enough." There were other changes. The children stopped flinching at sudden noises. Josiah began to speak more, asking about horses, about the stars. The older girl, Annabeth, started to help Ruth with cooking, her small hands mimicking her mother's with soft pride. The middle child, Ellie, followed Jonah like a shadow, always watching, always learning. The house felt fuller. Not crowded, but lived in. The kitchen carried the scent of bread. The walls held warmth. At night, a lantern burned in the window, not out of fear, but as a sign that someone was home. One morning, Jonah found Ruth standing near the corral, one hand resting on the fence. Her hair was loose, caught by the breeze, and her eyes were on the horizon. "You think he'll try again?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Then maybe." She nodded. "I'm not afraid of him anymore." "You shouldn't be." "I'm not even angry," she said. "Not like before." "What are you?" She turned toward him then. "Tired, but ready." They stood in silence, the wind curling around them like a question waiting to be answered. Behind them, the house stood steady. Not grand, not new, but strong. Weathered like them. Jonah looked at her, at the shape of the life they'd been building without quite naming it. And then, without ceremony, he said, "You don't have to leave, Ruth. Not when the thaw comes. Not ever." She looked at him a long while, her expression unreadable. "Then I know." Spring turned to summer with little fanfare. The fields greened, the creek ran high with meltwater, and birds nested in the eaves of the barn like they'd always belonged there. Days stretched long, and work came thick, planting, mending, tending to the animals as calves grew and fences wore thin again. Ruth had taken to rising before the sun, her hands stained with soil and her skirts damp with dew before the first rooster crowed. The children followed her lead, never whining, never dragging their feet. They had grown lean and quick, and sun-browned faces fuller than they'd been in the winter. Jonah watched them from the porch some mornings the way a man watches a storm build in reverse, slowly, steadily, bringing light instead of ruin. He found himself walking slower through the house, quieter in the mornings, just to catch the sounds of life. Bread dough rising, wood creaking beneath small feet, Ruth humming to herself in the pantry. The hush of it all felt like a blessing no one had prayed for but somehow deserved. They began to share the land like they shared the work, without question. The corner room had become the children's. Ruth had moved her things into the spare, though more often than not Jonah woke to find the smell of her still in the kitchen, her shawl draped over the rocker, her coffee beside his on the table. They didn't talk about what they were becoming, didn't press on it. It was enough to move toward each other in small ways, his hand brushing hers when passing the salt, her voice low when reading aloud at night. Every gesture was quiet, but none of it was uncertain. One evening in late June, after supper, Jonah brought out a small box he'd carved from cedar. The smell was sharp and clean, like rain on dry wood. He set it in front of her without a word. Ruth looked at it, then at him. "What is it?" "It's something that belonged to my mother," he said. "She gave it to me after my wife died. Said I'd know when to pass it on." She lifted the lid slowly. Inside was a simple silver ring, worn thin with time but carefully kept. No jewel, no inscription, just a smooth band. Ruth's breath caught. "I'm not asking you to decide tonight," Jonah said, eyes steady. "I just want you to know what I'd choose if it were up to me." She ran her thumb over the ring, silent for a long time. Finally she said, "You're sure?" "I've never been more." Her fingers closed around the box. She stepped close and placed her hand over his heart. No kiss, no tearful vows. Just that, a promise in silence. "I need time," she whispered. "You've got it," he said. And she did. The weeks passed and the world kept testing them. A stray cow went missing during a storm and was found 3 days later, weak but alive. Josiah caught a fever that left him glassy-eyed and shaking until Ruth refused sleep to nurse him through. Jonah lost a section of fencing to rot, and they worked side by side in the heat, blistered and burned until it was rebuilt. Every time the world pushed, they held. Not without wear, not without pain, but they held. In late summer a letter came, addressed in a shaky hand, from a woman in Missouri who'd once known Ruth's mother. "I saw her in town," the letter said, "and she looked like a woman who had survived more than her share. Tell her she's not forgotten." Ruth folded the letter and slipped it into her sewing tin. She didn't say anything, but that night she stood out by the fence for a long time, the moonlight silvering her face. Jonah joined her without speaking, his hand finding hers. She laced her fingers through his. "I think I'm ready," she said. The next morning they told the children. Annabeth asked if that meant they'd stay here forever. Jonah smiled. "Only if you want to." Eli asked if there'd be cake. Ruth laughed. "We'll see." Josiah just leaned into her leg and held on. They married under the cottonwoods near the creek in a quiet ceremony with no preacher, just words shared under the open sky. The children picked wildflowers. Jonah wore his best shirt. Ruth wore her mother's ribbon tied in her hair. There were no guests but the land, the house, the wind that carried away the last of what they'd left behind. After they shared bread and stew at the table, Ruth poured coffee. Jonah said grace not with flourish, but with the slow reverence of a man who had known hunger and silence, and the rare taste of hope come true. That night, after the children were asleep, they stood at the door and looked out over their land. The porch creaked beneath their feet. The lantern flickered behind them. Jonah slipped the silver ring onto her finger. Ruth didn't say a word. She just held his hand and leaned into him, the scent of summer grass and cedar thick in the air, and knew this was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of one. If you've ever felt forgotten and longed for hope, subscribe and follow these roads with us.